Hello, everyone. Welcome on this new episode of Education Futures. Today, I'm very excited to be with Ed Fidoe. Hello, Ed. Welcome on the show.
Hi, Svenia. Thanks for having me.
Very happy to have you, Ed. For me, you're a true education visionary. You've built several education institutions from the ground up. You're going to tell us a bit more about this. But yeah, just as a short introduction, Ed is a British education entrepreneur and reformer. You co-founded School 21 in London, and then you founded later the London Interdisciplinary School. It's a university designed to tackle complex global problems through interdisciplinary applied learning. And Ed, my first question to you, it's a burning question that is on my mind. Some say that higher education is facing a crisis that we have never seen until now. What are your thoughts on this? Are the traditional degree models completely outdated now with the AI, in the AI era? What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I was actually talking to the team about this yesterday. So when we set out to found LIS, we were in a context of 2019, so pre-COVID, pre-inflation, pre sort of very different attitudes to immigration in terms of the policies that our governments had. And we were, in a sense, challenging a sector that everybody thought was perfectly fine. I mean, the UK higher education sector has historically been seen as a jewel in the United Kingdom's crown, something to be just supported. All of the debates and discussions were about access. So what kinds of people get to go to university and how much should be charged. And it was presumed that more people should go and that what they got there was clearly worth it. And that, graduates got a premium when they went into the workplace. And so that's when we started, and we were saying, well, the single discipline degree has lots of negative effects, and in a couple of sentences, it has a negative effect on the school system because it forces schools to narrow their offer to students. So students are sort of only studying 3 subjects by the time they're doing sixth form, often in a single subject area, and it's also not good for the kind of the economy, for the workforce, because you've got a bunch of people who sort of don't believe they can do a whole bunch of things, right? Because they say, well, I'm a scientist, I did a science degree, I don't do all these other things, I don't know anthropological methods, or or the reverse. If people who did humanities, they say, I don't do maths. This isn't good in a world where most people are facing a range of problems and therefore need a kind of range of skills. But since 2019, the higher education sector has been turned completely upside down. Back then, it was basically, there were some complaints about vice chancellors' salaries, you might remember, and that was about it. But then you had COVID, you had the responses of them sort of locking students into the halls with Harris fencing. You had a real kind of crisis of confidence in how universities thought about, particularly their undergraduates. You've had falling numbers of international students, basically the financial model upon which universities were built. You've had high inflation and student fees staying exactly the same. They've just started to change. But in a world of 2% inflation, it didn't really matter that they stayed at £9,000. In a world where we've had inflation between 8 and 10% for a couple of years, 3 years in a row, then it's a big problem. So universities, the financial model for many universities now, it just doesn't work. And they are essentially like boiled frogs. The vice chancellors are sitting there, not making decisions, not doing anything, waiting for the next term to come along, as in the next sort of vice chancellor's term. They're not used to having to make bold structural changes to their institution. This is before you even get to AI. So there are a perfect storm. I don't think this is a cyclical problem. This is a structural problem now for higher education institutions. And I think that will come out of this period of 5 or 6 years with fewer rather than more. And the ones that survive will probably be the old ancient ones, as you might expect, because people still want to go there. And they can probably carry on pretty much the same because the sort of kudos of those degrees is still very high, and they do lots of great research and students still have a good experience. But I think anybody else is going to have a very distinctive model, have to be able to prove their worth and prove that it's worth going somewhere for 3 years or however long the degrees are to study, and that they've got the skills that are resilient in the new world, whatever that looks like. And that's where we have to start talking about AI.
So is the LIS a degree awarding university?
Yes. Yeah, we are a degree awarding university. And in the UK, this is quite rare. So there's only 175 institutions with DAPS, degree awarding powers. In America, it's about 4,000, 5,000. So it's a very different thing. It's much harder to get them. They're very, very protected here. So it was a real jewel in our crown, or a sort of, it's an important strategic advantage that we have these things. And that number may go down rather than up. I'd always assumed it was just going to climb up to 200, they
Mm.
go down from 175. We have degree awarding powers, which means we can create completely unique degrees. We don't have to worry about somebody else validating them or rubber stamping them. We are self-regulated. We have to have external academics saying that what we're doing is legitimate. And we do that from people from the top institutions. But we put forward innovative, new, cut from whole cloth programs. I think we have probably the most exciting contemporary offer of programs anywhere in the country now. We have 3 masters. One is called Education Futures, actually. Don't know if you'd spotted that. We have an MBA, which we've just launched, and we have a bachelor's degree, and they are all completely new. And so that's the ability that degree awarding powers gives us.
Amazing. Well done, because I guess it must not have been an easy path to become a degree awarding university. Tell us more about NIS. What is different for a student that chooses to study at your university?
Well, I think the first thing to start with is the what. What are they studying? The content of it. And our diagnosis was that university should be for something. And I think too much it's become about kind of ranking yourself or sort of organizing where you sit in the kind of cognitive elite. Are you a Bristol student or a St Andrews student or an Oxford student, whatever that means, right? Not really about what you're going there for.
Hmm.
So we think increasingly the things that will remain in this world are complex problems. They are here to stay. In a world that's ever changing, where we're not quite sure what jobs are going to look like, we are going to have to be dealing with some complex problems. That's a bet that we're taking. And those complex problems do not organize themselves like a library. And our education system is still organized like it's a library, like the world is a library. So, you walk down a corridor in a library, and that's social sciences, and that's what you go and study at university. And that was done for good reasons historically, because you had to store knowledge somewhere, and you stored it in books and you stored it in brains in universities. There was nowhere else to store knowledge. But now knowledge, of course, is everywhere. It's stored in increasingly unfathomable ways. And you can access it in all kinds of manner of combinations. And we think that students need to come to university in order to be able to tackle complex problems later in life. So to do that, it has to be interdisciplinary. You have to break the library model. And that's what we've done. So we have an organizing conceit. The organizing function is complex problems. This is on the undergraduate. So you start with the complex problems like AI and ethics, and then you say, right, you're going to learn some law, some data science. You might learn some machine learning skills, and you put those together to tackle a complex problem. Or if you're looking at sustainability, you might look at material science. You might look at we looked at neuroscience, or was that for inequality? We take these different disciplinary perspectives, and then the students are learning methods as well. So they're learning methods that come from a range of disciplines. So quantitative methods, qualitative methods, things like coding, statistics, as well as anthropological methods, survey design, these kinds of things. And visual methods. You've got an art faculty here, so that you've got students that aren't like, oh, I do art, not numbers, or vice versa. They're like, yeah, I've done some coding in Python. I know some artistic methods to be able to kind of visualize the data that I'm creating from this NLP model that I've built. This is sort of, these are not alien people that can do these things. We can all, many, many, many capable people that go to university can learn all these tools.
Hmm. But do you have a common core for your bachelor's?
Yeah. So the specifics of how they actually works. We're small. So when you're small, you can't give lots of choice. So that's the
Hmm.
trade-off. So we generally try and err on the side of core prescribed program that's high quality rather than offering lots of choice. And actually it's not economical because we'd have people sort of in classes of 3 or 5 or whatever. It'd be nice with students, but so there's a core in the first year. It's pretty much all prescribed the first 2 terms. And then you start to have electives in year 2 and 3. But we always want students to be choosing a range of quant and qual. But in the 3rd term, they do a project which is based on a problem that they're passionate about. So that's when you get this huge range of things. So it's
Hmm.
extraordinary choice in the 3rd term. In the 3rd year, it's their whole year. They're working through the capstone alongside their courses. It's a problem that they're passionate about. It has to be a complex problem that needs a real audience. They need to create a real product at the end of it, and as well as an academic paper alongside it. So this is something that typically is asked for sometimes at master's level, and we get them going on this kind of work in the first year, they have to do something very unusual in education. They have to discover a problem that they want to tackle, which, as you'll know, in most education systems, you definitely don't do that at school. You're given the problem and you're told to underline the answer, and you're not even told what the implications of the answer might be or anything like that. Here, they are trying to discover a problem they want to tackle, and they are coming up with imperfect answers because perfect answers don't exist. And then they're trying to think about what that means.
Where does it come from? Your this inspiration that you have to create completely new educational models. Where does it come from?
Frustration, probably. Annoyance. I mean, it's not. And by the way, the ideas are not remotely all mine. I've had about 2 or 3 ideas in about 15 years, which is like, we should start a new kind of school and we should start a new kind of university.
Yeah, but you
And it
you you
shouldn't
you
look, and it
gone
shouldn't
through
look,
it.
and it shouldn't look like the existing system. After that, you need to source ideas from a bunch of different places. So the founding teams of both, Peter and Ollie, who were the founders of School 21 alongside me, brought many more ideas than I did. I was more just sort of pushing to be different. And then with this, the founding faculty, they're the ones that craft the curricula, and the masters, which is different again, and the MBA, which we push to be really different. That's really, really exciting. Very, very different kind of model where we're trying new kinds of pedagogies, new kinds of content. But it comes from frustration, Svenia, to be honest. I mean, I was bored at school. I think a lot of people were bored at school. I went to a lovely school. It was really good. And I got very good GCSE results, and I got good A-level results. So it worked for me as such. But it feels like, what I don't like is this complacency we have that, or a sort of feeling, in a sense, that it's this ranking. I'm coming back to the ranking. That's what I don't like. If you can get into Oxford, you're going to be okay. Not based on what you'll learn. That's the thing that bugs me. Not based on what you'll be able to do,
Mm.
but just based on the fact that you got in. So it's essentially, and almost then you're kind of owed a career. There's a feeling. When I was at university in '96, I went to Imperial. I could tell there's a bunch of people I went there with who got A's at university and got into Imperial. They're like, well, we're done now. We sort of deserve a good graduate job. And they kind of got one because of the nature, we were in a different economy then. But now that's not true. So first of all, it's not true to say that you're just going to go to Oxbridge and get a or similar and get a great job. But it's not good enough. We need people who really be trying to push themselves to be the best they can be, because we face some pretty big challenges in our world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And are your students afraid? Are they scared of their future? What do they tell you about that? And what do you feel? How do you feel about this whole crazy debate around entry level jobs and all disappearing because of AI? How do you feel about that?
Well, they're worried about lots of things. So actually, a lot of them get quite depressed quite early on in the course because we're talking about these big problems.
Mm,
And it's not that they didn't know about the problems; it's that they didn't really realize how hopeless it might make them feel that they're not just going to solve them when they come here.
mm,
Um, and I think there's an element in that we've got to be careful of our marketing, that we don't overpromise that they're going to come here and solve all these problems, right? Because of course they're not. That's the thing. So lots of these problems will take a lifetime. I'll spend most of my career kind of trying to do something about education and won't make much of a difference in the end. It's hard. So they feel, and then I think what happens is the students reframe the kind of level at which they're thinking about a problem. So they go from thinking about the system, and a lot of people talk about system change, right? And there's lots of debates about how do we change the system. But if you start there, your chances of success are very, very slim. There's very few case examples where people can go, here's where a system got completely transformed. The very few, and yet we still walk around talking about system change. So what they start to do is they start to say, how about if I could come up with if I interrogate whether, if I don't like the pollution in the air in a city, what if we greened all of the paved area in people's front yards in London? What would that what would that cost? How would we get it done? What would that do to the quality of air, the quality of people's health? What would we save in the NHS? And this is still a big, ambitious project or idea, but it's tangible, it's doable, you can measure it. There's a beginning, middle, and end. You'd know when you've done it. And so they start to do that across a range of different topics of things they're interested in. And at that point, they start to have hope that maybe they can move things along, because that is, the progress is the sum of all of us trying to move things along a little bit. AI, you mentioned, I don't know. I don't know more than anybody else really about what's happening there. I mean, clearly there's a kind of economic aspect to this anyway, a cyclical economic aspect where we're in a slump and have been for a very long time, probably pre the financial crisis in 2008. So that's a problem. But it is definitely true when you speak to some employers, particularly in sort of financial services and some professional services firms, they're not hiring as many people because of
Right.
AI, directly because of AI.
Mm.
And I have there's institutes like the Windfall Trust who are thinking about this. They are looking at the fact that, we could have mass unemployment in quite a short amount of time. That's scary. And I think what's really scary is that politicians aren't thinking about it enough.
Mm. Absolutely.
But we can't solve that problem. Like all we can do is try and say complex problems. You're probably still going to have to think about that. But we
Absolutely.
can't push back the tides of change that are coming.
No, no, you can't. Why are so few universities redesigning themselves fundamentally today? Although it's needed, right? And what would you say to a higher education or university dean, a vice provost hearing this? Like, where should they start, right?
Yeah,
Because AI is exposing where change is needed.
yeah,
So the things that were not working are not working 10x now because
yeah,
of this. So
yeah.
what would you say to them?
Well, again, there's different levels. So you can be at the level of AI is making general teaching and assessment difficult. So that's the kind of technical thing, but that's assuming that what we're trying to do is teach the right stuff. But having said that, we shouldn't ignore that there is a possibility now that the ancient Oxford tutorial model of writing an essay and then coming and talking to somebody in a 2 or a 3 to the tutor every week or 2 weeks actually looks pretty robust now. That's hard to hack if you've just had, Claude write your essay and then you show up. That's going to get found out pretty fast. So what does that mean? That means that the people that are doing it are still having to think, they're still having to learn, they're still having to take on knowledge, they're still having to build an argument, they're still having to do all those things. Is the skill of writing an essay much use anymore? Really questionable. The skill of thinking and weighing different arguments and trying to kind of come up with a point of view, that is still, I think, hopefully going to be of value, right? So we should look for these pockets where actually there may be, by pure chance, some of the most traditional old-fashioned models um, could be resilient and still useful. Then the question is, if you go up a level from sort of how do you assess and how do you make sure students aren't hacking the system, what are the skills that we need in an AI world? And that's harder. So I used to think that if you could wrestle with different domains, then AI would be very slow to be able to do that, because early AI models, basically the sort of reinforcement learning AI, which is different to the LLMs, was domain specific initially. It would sort of choose a domain like chess and just get really, really good at it, or it would choose a domain like Go and get even, and quickly get better than a human in the end. But it was domain specific. And so being able to transfer across different schema of knowledge, I thought it might struggle with. But then LLMs came along, and obviously they can kind of surf the entire quantity of human knowledge. So that skill of being able to move between different disciplines is not necessarily as robust. I still think it's very useful. I think one skill is this thing I've talked about, trying to decide what problems to solve. I don't think AI can do that yet. I don't think any versions of the AI are going to be able to figure out what are the important problems that we need to try and tackle or move forward with, because in essence, that will still be a political decision, but we need to get better at that. So if I'm saying to vice chancellors, what do you need to do? I think they need to be willing to change entire the entire program learning outcomes, right? Because they can do that. They can say either they do it with existing programs or they create entirely new programs. And they should say sort of what learning outcomes, what do we want graduates to be able to do? And let's design some programs, no matter who has to collaborate with who. Then the second thing they have to do is break down the political and structural barriers between departments, which are very, very real, very
Mm.
difficult, and the financial barriers, right? So they need money for this and political energy for it. if your university is about to go out of business, it might be easier to do this kind of thing because you've got the kind of burning platform to do it on. But the reasons they don't do it is they've never had to do it. They're realistically not managers. People in university are not managers in the sense that sort of an Intel manager would call themselves a manager, right? They don't manage a business, and you've never had new entrants. The sort of prestige from top to bottom is directly correlative with how old an institution is. So, you don't get a prestigious new entrant. We're trying to be that in a sense, right? We're trying to come in and take the students away from Oxbridge, and we're doing that, and academics. But it's hard. It's going to be hard to continue to do it because being old is very valuable. Well, you don't have to do anything to be old. You just have to still be around, and they're very rich. So they don't have to do much. So that's partly why it hasn't changed. And because everyone wants to emulate the old ones, they all sort of keep doing the same old thing. And they're not threatened by, you don't have Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma here in universities. They're not going to get innovated out like taxi firms or like banks or like, whatever. They're very, very different.
You talked about creating new degrees, completely new degrees from the ground up. And one master's degree that you have started recently is the Education Futures Masters. So obviously we love that title, and and
Right.
I'd love to hear more about what's in it for
Yeah.
students, and yeah, what do you teach?
So this is new. I mean, we're actually doing our first public kind of discussion with an audience about it today, this afternoon.
Oh,
We've launched this public. People can apply, but we haven't started teaching it yet. The first teaching will be this autumn. So the founding cohort for Education Futures would be starting in late September. It's always a special thing to be part of a founding cohort. So what will we be teaching? So what we wanted to be able to do here is do something very different to an MEd, but it will include some elements that you might expect in an MEd. And this isn't just for people who teach in a school environment or a university environment. It's people who are interested in education and the future of education, okay, and how people learn. So you might be somebody that works in a large organization. You're part of the learning function or the talent development function, or an education consultant, or indeed a teacher. We expect about half of the people to be kind of full-time teachers of some kind. So what do we do? So there's three parts to it. There's the interdisciplinary toolkit that everybody who does a master's at LIS gets. I can talk more about what that's in that. There is the education bit. And then there's this capstone bit where you work through a problem that you're passionate about. And that is where our master's students who are on our existing masters really do extraordinary things. Let's start with the education bit. There, we zoom out and understand education as a system and actually try and answer some of the questions that you've been asking me, which is why has this been slow to change? Why is the education system so kind of turgid, if you like, right? What is it about the nature of it as a system? So there's systems thinking, you learn some complexity, which is part of the interdisciplinary toolkit. And we kind of play through some of the different political structural challenges that the education system has faced. And then we zoom in another part of the degree and look at what's happening at the bleeding edge, because there is change happening, but it's in pockets. So what's happening from a pedagogical perspective, an assessment perspective, how is AI playing into this? What are some kind of really leading edge pedagogical practices? And actually we will kind of embody some of those things. And that's where it kind of gets interesting, because the course is both about pedagogical futures, but also we will be using some of them. And then you've got the toolkit. So the toolkit is about saying that people need to continue with this breadth, right? So they need to be able to be comfortable with data and information. And that might sound a bit nerdy, but we class data as words, images, algorithms, and numbers, right? So data comes in all these different forms. And so you get to choose whether you want to focus on, let's say, coding and kind of visual methods or some other combination. And you'll also learn about integration, which is the education system is really poor with. So even on my engineering degree, which was about engineering, there wasn't any integration of the different things I was learning. They were just separate exams. So there's an integration module, there's a complexity module, there's these methods where you learn how to interrogate data. There's education where we zoom out and look at the system as a whole and understand systems thinking, understand aspects of how it's shifted or hasn't shifted. Then we zoom in and we look at the different pedagogical kind of practices and assessments and so on. And then students will say, right, this is an area of education this is a problem I'd like to get my teeth into, right? Some might say, hey, I'd like to start a new university, so I'm going to develop a kind of business plan for the university, and that would be their capstone. It'd be a good idea. or or it could be something completely different, really on the fringes of what you might think of as education. Or they might be looking at the role of technology in education, and then they do a capstone, and they would be supervised through that, and they would be bringing some of the methods that they've learned to bear, some of their data collection analytic methods, and they would be creating a product from that, and that is essentially then a calling card for them for what they want to do next, if they want to get a new job or branch out on their own or just move on within the company they're already in. That piece of work, as we've seen, become a real calling card for people.
Amazing. It sounds like all of the LIS students are change makers in some way. They learn how to solve complex problems. I'm really curious to know what they do after LIS. Do they build companies? What do they do? What do they end up doing?
Well, I mean, look, we're young as an institution, so we only have a couple of years of graduates. So the most important thing from my perspective, so that I could sleep at night, is that they do stuff, they do cool stuff. So they're getting jobs, they're going into higher education, further education beyond, at rates that match at least the Russell Group. So that is a big relief for me, because many of them chose not to go to Russell Group universities and come to us. So they're doing cool stuff. So in terms of the jobs they do, I mean, some of them are going to work. We've had somebody go to work in sort of management in the NHS. We've just had somebody from an undergraduate employed us on the fast stream of the civil service. But also we had somebody who's working for now a venture capital firm. Somebody's working for Goldman Sachs. Somebody's working for the mergers team at KPMG. You then got some people that are working in startups of various kinds. Some of the bachelor students are doing their own thing. 2 or 3 have started their own business. Some of them are doing academic stuff. So one of them has actually, as an undergraduate, had a piece of work she did in her final year published in an academic paper. And one of our master students has just gone on to a fully funded PhD at Cambridge, which is very unusual. So all years fully funded by the
Wow.
university. And this is kind of puts paid to the idea that the interdisciplinary programs are sort of broad but shallow. It's actually not, it's the opposite of that. So you do get a range, I would say a range rather than kind of a sort of breadth, in a sense. You get a range of different things that would be in different parts of the library. But then when you bring them together, you create very unusual specialisms. So the person that is going off to do a PhD at Cambridge is going to be one of his leading specialists in that particular area of digital humanities, using digital tools to analyze history in different new ways. He is absolutely at the vanguard of that. It's something he did in his capstone in the masters, and he wouldn't have done that if he hadn't come here and learned how to code, learn how to use data in a certain way. He was a history undergraduate,
Amazing.
and now he's right at the bleeding edge of looking at history in new ways. So yeah, and so there's. You might have expected me to say there's a whole range of different things, but there's a whole range of different things. And at some point in the future, some of them are going to start having some pretty big impacts on the world, we hope.
What is That's amazing. What is the AI policy for your students? Do you have like an LIS policy regarding the AI usage of the students
Yeah.
in the
So,
staff? And
so I would say we're not. So we need to think more about this. I mean, we can't. So often we sort of look at each other and go, on this particular topic, are we going to be reinventing the wheel completely from scratch? Are we going to be at the bleeding edge, or are we just going to try and be good enough for now? And on AI, it's time for us to do another round of real deep thinking on this. But right now, our students, there's a sort of 3 levels. So either the students are encouraged to use AI in any way they want, they're encouraged to use it, but to document only in a constrained way and document how they've used it. And some things they're asked not to use it at all. And some people are surprised, why would you ever say not to use it at all? But we are in the business of learning, not just performance. So if you were just trying to execute, then why would you restrict AI? But if you're trying to learn, I think there is a time and a place to restrict AI in order to be able to perform later. So, back to my example at Oxford, right? If you're going to try and really learn and wrestle with ideas that may be in 2 different books, probably the version of you doing that without using AI may in the long run be better for you.
definitely. I fully agree with that.
Great.
If we go to the K-12 system, because you've also built a School 21,
Yeah.
and I would love to know more about the school of the future, and that's something I ask all of our guests. If we had to build a school K-12 that is future proof, um, how would it look like? And maybe your answer is like School 21, it already
No,
exists.
no, no, no. Look, the thing. Look, we already say at LIS that the bachelor's degree was designed in 2020, basically, and we've got to make sure in 5 years it doesn't look a bit 2020. And School 21 was designed in 2012. So that is old, right? So there are students that came and joined us at 11 years old that have long graduated from School 21. There are students that came at 4 years old. In fact, there's a student that I think came to School 21 when he was 6, and now he's set to enroll at LIS, which is sort of terrifying.
Amazing.
Quite emotional for me, but terrifying as well. So look, I don't know what the school of the future looks like, but the starting point, you have to be able to start from the kind of purpose side of it, and you have to. The problem we've got in school, the problems that schools have, if you think like me in terms of what you would like the schools to do, the problem they've got is, and I understand why they've got this, is the standardized exams that everyone has to take and Ofsted, right? But I understand why they're there, and they're there for good reasons. And they were brought in for good reasons. And lots of people on the progressive side of education don't agree with me on this, but including Peter, who I started the school with, who is my mentor in so many ways. But on GCSE, standardized exams were brought in to try and level the playing field for people so that it wasn't a kind of grace and favor system, right? So that if you were from a disadvantaged background and you got an A at maths or English, you would be treated the same as someone of privilege who got an A. And that's a good thing. And if we chuck it all out, we've got to be careful about what we replace it with. And most examples that I see that people want to replace it with, private schools would be better at gaming than state schools by miles. Right? Because there would be this broad, all singing, all dancing set of skills that private schools would be they just would be able to invest the time, money and effort and inclination into giving these students a much better passport. So immediately you would have a big problem with disadvantage. You might crack the breadth of education point, but I think you'd have a big disadvantage point. So I think it's hard. But those would be the things that constrain schools in terms of a model that is future-proof. But we need, this is a bit of a cop-out answer, but we need natural experiments to be happening. I mean, there are no experiments happening in education, very few. So ideally, there would be 50 LIS projects around the country, and 3 of them would end up being the shit, right? They would end up being the thing that's the future of education. And there's basically like us and a couple of others that are trying their best in engineering, particularly for some reason. So there's a couple of engineering colleges that started at the same time as us. But that's it. And that's not, we might be right. We might have discovered what the future of education is. We might not have done. But if you're interested in the future of the system, you need evolution, which means mutation, which means, and then survival of the fittest. And you also need old things that don't work to die. So none of that is happening in the education system. And in schools, it doesn't happen because, and I understand again why this is the case, people don't like being part of an experiment. They don't think young people should be part of an experiment. School 21 was an experiment, but it was an experiment that required huge effort, huge amounts of very real concentrations of talented people. Not really extra money, although we did fundraise a bit of extra money, but we did that to kind of launch this Oracy charity, Voice 21. But I mean, it's really hard to try something different without risking people's educational results. And at School 21, we got, the students that got their first set of GCSE results, despite being in a really disadvantaged part of the UK, were in the top 5% of students in the country. And they'd done projects and they'd done Oracy and a bunch of other things, and they still nailed their GCSE results. But turns out that's pretty unsustainable. It was pretty unsustainable because the forces of gravity pull you back towards doing it the same old way. Because in the end, although we started with an outstanding Ofsted, if you trip up for a split second, the system just says, look, play it safe. So natural experiments are very, very hard. We have 23,000 schools, whatever the number is, very few. If you ask people who are doing things differently, it's the same 5 schools. It's the same 5 schools. It's really, really depressing. So how do we change that? If you're the education secretary, you've got to think about how you introduce innovation, basically.
And you say it's so hard because you need to follow basically the GCSE standards, and you need to follow and this is what makes it so hard. You're in the box and you cannot,
So the reason I wanted to start LAS initially was because I thought, wait a minute, university admissions is creating this narrowing effect on K-12. And if universities said, we need to see we need you to be able to jump 4 foot as part of your entrance exam. Then you schools around the country would start employing like jumping experts, right? Or sort of start training people on their calf muscles, because that's what parents would demand, because that's what the system needs. So universities admissions is extraordinarily powerful, but they do that passively. They're not interested in the K-12 system. They just want to know who's coming in for that. But they have this huge influence. So I thought, what if you start a new institution with a different kind of admissions policy and show that maybe you can do this differently? But I don't think LS is going to change the UK admissions system. But at least we're sending a signal that breadth has something to recommend it. And if more university courses did that, then schools might start to relax a bit on kind of this 3 A levels that are all the same, which is really constraining.
Mm. And I'm very curious to know about the pedagogical innovations that you put in place at School 21. I understand
Yeah.
that it's really difficult to innovate within the system,
Yeah.
but I know that you've put some really innovative things in place, and your pedagogy is based on RC. If you could tell our listeners
Yeah.
what that is, for those who
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
know.
Well,
Um,
let's talk about Oracy. I mean, Oracy's now, I said earlier you can't change the system, but in Oracy, I think we may have had an impact on the system in the work that's been done there. It's been led by a wonderful, brilliant leader called Becky Earnshaw. She stepped down a couple of years ago, but she worked with us right at the beginning to create this charity called Voice 21. What's Oracy? So in schools, there's this traditional idea that silent classroom is a good classroom. And students can buckle down, get their exams. Most universities don't interview you. Very rare, actually, to be interviewed. So you can get into university. You can then pretty much do the same. You can go through university without really talking to anybody. And we'd seen actually some data that said that, particularly in inner city areas, students barely said a word in class. They said 4 words every 2 hours or something on average, which meant that over the course of 5 years of being at school, they spoke for about 2 hours in total. And they're not being coached on how to do it better. And then you're popped into the real world. And in our view, you've been sold a lie, because if you can't communicate in different settings, and it's not just public speaking, it's speaking like this between 2 people, it's speaking in a group of 4 around a table, it's speaking to people that are more senior than you, more junior than you, more experienced than you. In school, you only talk to your peers. They are at the exact same level as you, and a teacher. That's or the head teacher. And in the head teacher, you speak to them, you look at your toes, you say sorry, and you kind of trying to get out of the room as quickly as possible. If your next experience of being someone of authority is a job interview, that isn't going to work, right? And if you haven't had that coaching. So we wanted oracy to be considered as important as literacy and numeracy. And oracy is speaking. It's a word that was invented in the 80s, which is a bit like literacy, but for speaking. So we created a curriculum around it. We flipped our assemblies so that oracy for students was a big part of the assemblies. So they were doing the talking as much as the teachers were doing the talking. And we wanted to thread the techniques into every lesson. So our maths teachers learned oracy techniques. So the students were standing opposite each other in lines, explaining equations to each other orally. Our art teacher was using oracy methods, bringing kind of ideas from critiques from architecture schools in, so that people were asking questions and critiquing and commenting, giving feedback. And we had we have a framework for how to kind of give people feedback on their speaking, so that it's more sophisticated than just look up, speak louder, which is what most people will say, right? So you get feedback on your physicality, on your linguistic skills, on your cognitive skills, how you organize an argument, and on your social emotional skills of how you kind of connect with an audience. Again, not just an audience of thousands, but an audience of 1 or 2 people. So this is now, in 2013, when we started doing this, we were the only people using this word oracy, and everyone said that word won't catch on because it's hard to say and spell, which is true. But we had an oracy lead in our school. So in the UK, there was 1 oracy lead, and now 25% of the schools in the UK have an oracy lead. So it's 6,000 or
Amazing.
7,000, and the same number roughly have an oracy strategy. Now, whether or not those strategies are good and those leads are doing good work, I'm sure many, many of them are. And most importantly, they're talking about it. And it's a focus and it's a priority. And all governments of all colours now recognise the importance of oracy. So
Amazing.
that is an example of some system change, actually. So that's a bit of hope.
Amazing, amazing. I mean, well done on this work. It's really important, and I wonder if in all of your experiments, do you work with researchers to make it evidence based somehow, or do you work with with
Yeah, I think
labs?
so. We're a bit so not as much as some people would like us to. With Oracy, we did work with Cambridge and an academic there called Neil Mercer. So then we did, and that was partly our funders encouraged us to, but partly it's we thought it was a good idea. But with others, we are kind of empirical researchers. So we, we appear in other people's research. I mean, LAS is a case study in a paper somewhere, right? So, we are the empirical evidence that something works or doesn't work. And there are some things we did at School 21, and there's some things we do here which don't work, and we drop them. Or don't work for us. Doesn't mean they don't work, full stop, right? But we are, we exist, and we're being public about it, and we let people come and visit, and we will work with researchers, but we are not. And it's ironic because we are a place here with academics, right, with researchers, but only a couple of them are education
Hmm.
academics. But
Hmm.
they're having the time of their life because they're designing completely new programs, and they are, and that is action research, as I would call it, right? So you are saying, right, I've designed this program. Let's do this experiment, see if it works, and I can write a paper about it.
It's
So
amazing.
yeah,
It's amazing.
we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, they have the best jobs. Who should be our next guest, Ed? That's a question I ask at the end. Like, do you have anyone in mind? Maybe the faculty of your Education Futures Masters? I don't know, but
Yeah.
someone who really thinks about the future of education, the future of learning from the different angles. We love to have scientists, entrepreneurs. We love to have teachers. We love to have policymakers. Very different standpoints on the topic.
Well, you've got sort of from sort of product design, more like ed tech. There's a guy called Matt Walton who we have worked with quite a bit. I don't know if you know Matt. He might be somebody to think
Great
about.
idea.
And then Amelia Peterson, who's leading our MBA here, who did education PhD at Harvard School of Education, who is one of the most forward-thinking thinkers in education that I know, would be good. There's a lot. I mean, yeah, there's lots of people that I love talking to about
Yeah.
this stuff. So yeah, maybe I should send you a list afterwards.
Now, these two are amazing suggestions. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your time and insights, Ed. Thank
Yeah,
you.
great. Thanks, Sonia. Cheers.